One of the reasons we transmit infectious diseases is we cough and we sneeze when we're sick, and the virus rides that to get from us to someone else. Actually, for people to understand it, viruses are just adapted to survive, and in order to survive, they have to spread. And in order to spread, they need a mechanism to get from you to me or me to you. So the way they make us sick actually makes us transmit them. That's what they do. If you don't get sick, you can still transmit it by talking. Virus can be in water droplets, but we don't transmit droplets nearly as far just by talking as we would by coughing or sneezing.
Well, that sort of handles a lot of the fear about the asymptomatic people and the asymptomatic carriers.
So asymptomatic people are less likely to transmit because they don't have the symptoms that make them better transmitters. And again, distancing, mask use, important. But if you combine that with not having symptoms, you're not coughing, you're not sneezing. So if you're not singing together, if you're not shouting, if you do a bit of distancing and use masks, being asymptomatic actually makes you less likely to transmit. And kids don't tend to get very sick with this, so they don't have symptoms. So most of the evidence around the world says, yeah, it looks like older teenagers maybe are more like young adults and they can transmit it, but younger kids, they don't seem to transmit it very effectively at all, not to one another, not to their parents. There have even been cases documented where a kid in a household has it and nobody else living in the same home gets it.
Precisely because they don't get sick, because they don't have symptoms. I think that's so important. It's just a critical piece of the perspective that we need. Asymptomatic carriers are not the scourge of humanity. They're not something that, and I think that's another piece that the media is, pounding on constantly, that we need to have dread fear of people that look healthy because, they're asymptomatic and they could be spreading it everywhere, but
So every media report I've seen about the high percentage of people who are asymptomatic with COVID has said, and therefore the sky is falling because people without symptoms can transmit this. And I'm thinking, wait a minute.
Right.
The fact that most people who get this infection have no symptoms, they recover with no symptoms, how can that be a bad thing? What that means is most of the time this is mild. So people without symptoms could conceivably spread it, but we knew that the virus could be in our environment. We're being careful. We need to social distance. We need to wear our masks under certain circumstances. But if most people who get this have no symptoms, that's good news. And it does make you less likely to spread it. Not impossible. So again, we're not eliminating those other precautions until COVID recedes into the background noise of epidemiology. And again, to remind people, that won't be zero. Right? I mean, this bug is not going to disappear now. It's here. Like the flu doesn't disappear. We don't shut down our world, but the flu comes back every year, and some years are worse and some years are better, but it waxes and wanes. This virus will likely do the same, but once it settles into the background noise of epidemiology, we will go on with our lives. But the idea that kids don't tend to get sick, don't tend to transmit very effectively should be very reassuring for teachers.
I was hoping that you could touch a little bit on herd immunity.
Everything during the pandemic, Ellie, has become fraught and prone to very emotional interpretation. And herd immunity has always had that tendency. The idea is, you're going to get an infection and get over it and make antibodies to protect me. So, I'm kind of throwing you to the wolves, right? No, that's not the idea. I mean, the idea is that if you have infectious disease circulating in a population, and you can identify people for whom it's a particular risk, carefully shelter them away from it. And people for whom it's a relatively low risk, this happens with every infectious disease that circulates. We get it, we get over it, and to one degree or another, we're immune. And that one degree or another is important. Maybe we're immune forever, or maybe for some number of months. Maybe we're completely immune, or maybe we're partially immune. But one way or another, if you get over an infectious disease, you generally wind up with some degree of immunity, and that's especially true of viruses where we routinely make antibodies. When enough of us are through an infection and have some level of immunity, each of us represents a dead end. We can't transmit a virus we can't get. And so we become a way of protecting people who can't get exposed to this. Loved ones in nursing homes, frail elderly people, people for whom the virus is a bigger threat. So, with any given infection, let's say it's not a pandemic, the world goes about its business. People who have extreme health concerns may stay carefully sheltered away. And when the infection has finished running through a population, we have herd immunity. It stops spreading because everybody who's prone to get it has already gotten it and gotten over it. So that's what it means. So it's really not about throwing people to the wolves. And I would say that the idea of herd immunity with COVID-19 requires us to talk about risk stratification. Because the idea would be, look, we can identify people who are at elevated risk of bad outcomes. We don't want them exposed. They should not be in the mix. If we can identify the segment of the population where the risk of a bad outcome from COVID is no greater than the risk of a bad outcome from, say, commuting to work or other things people are exposed to all the time, that's the population that should just keep on keeping on. I would put myself in that group, and if we get it, most of us will be fine. Can't guarantee that, by the way. Bad stuff can always happen. In medicine, 30 years of clinical medicine, I saw bad things happen to people sometimes with no good explanation. Cancers that affect young people who do everything right. Why is that? We don't always know. So, with COVID, we're finding that there are some genetic risk factors. So these are not things you can see, but some young people who have a bad outcome, it turns out they had specific genes that seem to put them in elevated risk. So we can't guarantee anybody that they're going to have a mild case. But what we can say is at the population level, there are age groups and health groups where the risk of a bad outcome from COVID is very, very low, and lower than risks they take every day without thinking about it, like commuting to and from work. And that's the group that can develop herd immunity. Now, why do that? Well, because we want our lives back. We want the world back. We want something like life as we knew it before the pandemic. And we really have just two options. One is for enough of us to have gotten through this that the virus is no longer circulating and we have our lives back. And we do it in a risk stratified way so that the harms of that are minimized. And the other is to wait for a vaccine, but that means we're basically flattening the curve, sheltering in place, waiting for a vaccine. We don't know how long that's going to be. We've heard some encouraging news, but until we have a highly effective, very safe, mass-produced, universally distributed vaccine, until we have all of that, we don't have all of that. And nobody knows how long it's going to take, because at any step of the process, things could fall apart. So, maybe it will be months. It could still be years. We don't know. I'm hoping it'll happen fast.
There's never been a successful vaccine for coronavirus to date.
There has not. And for the most part, pandemics have ended historically with herd immunity achieved as a result of the infection running its course in populations that pretty much never ended with a vaccine. So that would be new. Sure, that would be great. If we have the fastest production of a very safe, highly effective vaccine in history, terrific. But counting on that is a fool's errand. So thinking of what will it take for us to restore some semblance of the lives we want and the lives we had, if we can't count on a vaccine. Let's do everything possible to get a vaccine, and let's certainly do everything possible to optimize treatments while we're working to get from here to there. But let's also understand, what are the implications if we don't have a vaccine in a year or 2 or 5? Do we want to still be sheltering in place and still be debating whether our kids go back to school 5 years from now?
Right.
I don't think so. So you have to talk about herd immunity. And then that leads into a discussion of how do you get there safely, and that means risk stratifying the population. And that's the idea of herd immunity. Nobody gets thrown to the wolves, but you basically say the people who can most safely get through this infection become the firewall for people who can't afford to be exposed.
Right, and if you risk stratify the population, does that mean that businesses can open to full capacity with the most vulnerable, of course, taking the precautions, people that are interacting constantly with the most vulnerable also taking precautions, but as you said, the rest of us that are healthy can go back to living, or that don't have risk factors go back to living, and businesses can be fully reopened? Is that?
So if you're in a part of the country like Connecticut where case counts are low and stable or falling, you're in a much better position to return to work and to school. if you've done the work of determining who's at high risk, who's at low risk, if you help individuals know their risk and be informed and empowered about their risk, then you can match your precautions and your protections to the level of risk. Some work sites put people at higher risk than others because people will be working more closely together. If you're shoulder to shoulder, if you're working in a kitchen, if it's hot, if you're sweating, if it's hard to wear a mask, risks might be higher than in a situation where everybody's got their desk 6 feet or more from everybody else and the air is cool and well circulated, right? So circumstances vary. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all response to the pandemic any more than SARS-CoV-2 is a one-size-fits-all threat in the first place. So we need to embrace nuance. But yes, I think if we do that, absolutely we can return to work and we can return to school and we can minimize the harms from the infection and we can minimize the harms from disrupting social determinants. There are a lot of people in this country and around the world who are hungry. There's a major report out just today on a massive increase in global hunger and malnutrition. And an estimate that 10,000 kids are dying monthly around the world because of hunger during the pandemic. 10,000 more kids, because hunger around the world's always been an issue, but 10,000 kids dying of malnutrition during the pandemic because of the pandemic and disruptions in food supply. So people not doing their jobs, that can disrupt critical supply chains. I mean, it's not a trivial issue, right? So whether we're thinking Connecticut, we're thinking the US, or we're thinking globally, in any one of those contexts, it's really important to strike the right balance. And I would argue what we want to do is minimize total harm. So yes, that's an argument for return to work, but judicious. And again, I think we'd have to talk about what makes sense for a specific work site, because it's going to vary, right? Circumstances
As you said,
are different.
match your protection and precaution with your level of risk.
Exactly. And the likelihood of exposure, which will vary, depend on what you're doing. I mean, we've all heard stories about meat packing plants, right? People are standing shoulder to shoulder, working hard. It's really hot. They probably take off their masks because they've got sweat dripping down their faces. And those have resulted in super spreading circumstances. Most of us don't work in a situation like that, so most of us going back to work, the risk would be quite low.
Thank you. This is Ellie Kousidis, and I approve this message.